Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Council of Algorithms. Today's topic is going to be on water rights and resource allocation. So, our question today is how should limited water be allocated during severe drought while protecting both human society and the long term health of ecosystems? And so, we have 6 participants in today's debate. They are Cassian, Orion, Mira, Halcyon, Vesper, and Justicar. So we'll give everyone a few moments to join the council chambers. If you're watching on Discord and happen to be uh, participating, feel free to answer the question yourself and tell us what you think. If you're watching this later on YouTube, please leave a comment and tell us your thoughts. Let's head on over to the council chambers. All right, so the full question that they're asking is this. In a region experiencing severe drought and conflicting agricultural, industrial, and residential water demands, what policy would you implement to allocate limited water resources, balancing the need of various stakeholders while minimizing long-term ecological damage and ensuring sustainable water management? So Cassian is our first respondent, and here are his specific policy proposals that he thinks we should implement. He mentions a hierarchical allocation framework, so looking at essential use first, so example, human survival, drinking, sanitation, and then looking at agricultural use, so having like some sort of fixed percentage of the essential quota, adjusted for crop water use efficiency, and then industrial use, so basically different industries that happen to need water for their needs, and then residential non-essential use. So think about like watering your grass and various like play or recreational activities. Um, so then he mentions implementing like a water allocation authority, so a governing body that helps regulate this, a quota system to ensure that there's a certain amount of water available for protecting wetlands and habitats, allowing for groundwater recharge. Um, he also mentions various data monitoring and periodic review, so various networks that can do gather real-time data, and then various incentives and penalties, so incentives for conservation, while also penalizing escalated use that isn't really necessary. And he also mentions various restorative justice mechanisms, so things that would help for reforestation, wetland restoration, community water education programs, so things that would kind of help facilitate this and educate people about why there's restricted water in the first place during this time. And then stakeholder consultation, dispute resolution. So, it's like, hey, my neighbor's, using my spigot for to water their lawn, various things like that. Could be petty, could be more extreme, like industries that are using above and beyond what they need to. He basically concludes that having a hierarchy like this can safeguard ecological integrity while also helping to protect the interest of those involved. Orion, again, we haven't heard from Cassian or Orion yet, so interested to see their perspectives. He Orion offers various similar frameworks. So again, this water resource management framework, so a data-driven platform that helps to aggregate the data in real time. Orion suggests using AI to predict short-term shortages and long-term trends. He also mentions a tiered water pricing and demand side management. So instead of like allocating certain percentages, basically like having different tiers for residential versus industrial or agriculture. So a little bit different than what Cassian was recommending. And then some water use quotas. So something that we've talked about before. He mentions kind of like similar to a traffic light, where we have like green for essential, yellow for caution, red for pause. So something very simple that people can understand. Investment in water reuse, desalination. So this would be important for coastal regions, basically being able to distill ocean water in order to use it as regular fresh water, and then the excess salt can be perhaps used somewhere else where it's needed. Ecological flow safeguards, so legislating certain percentages have to be used to go back into the ecosystem. Again, this idea of protecting wetlands and other allowing the water table to naturally refill. And then various stakeholder governance options, emergency drought protocols. So again, kind of this idea of predicting drops in supply, triggering certain safety measures, temporary shutdown, things like that. And then again, educating the people to understand, why we are restricting water consumption in a severe drought. And he says this works because of equity, sustainability, flexibility, and innovation. So let's hear what Mira has to say. Mira, again, is very focused on kind of serve other people and looking at those different things. Again, her icon is actually a wave, so a little bit fitting here. She suggests, again, this integrated water resource management, something that we've heard already, very similar language here. Stakeholder-driven water use management, so having different committees, perhaps at the regional, municipal, and community levels. Dynamic adjustments, so again, this idea of real-time metrics to figure out how to adjust and respond. Tiered pricing, very similar to what Orion was saying, having different rates for essential and premium usage, as well as incentive programs, something that Cassian mentioned. And then various ecological safeguards, so minimum flow requirements, again, to make sure that there's enough water flowing into wetlands or other areas. And if the reservoir falls below certain levels, having specific actions that happen. Command-side management and education, again, this idea of community outreach, and then long-term sustainability and resilience. So invest in storage, reuse, climate adaptation planning, a few things that we haven't seen specifically talked about like this. So all very important things. Bottom line, she says, policy is not a one-size-fits-all rule, but a living framework that has to evolve with the people and the environment it serves. Our next debate participant is Halcyon, again proposing this integrated water resource governance. So one of the things that I think we see similar language here because we are using a similar prompt in our AI model. And so they all kind of are referring to this generalized language. So that's why we kind of see some commonality, even though they represent different personalities, we are using the same AI model. Just kind of an explanation about why we're seeing that language here. So Halcyon mentions a multi-stakeholder water council with representatives from agriculture, industry, residential communities, local ecosystems, independent experts. A council isn't something that has been brought up. They've mentioned various governing bodies, but making sure that, again, they're stakeholders representative of all the people who are impacted. Tiered allocation, essential use, sustainable use, conservation initiatives, and incentives, all things that we've kind of talked about a little bit before. Adopting water efficiency credits, so this would incentivize people or perhaps allow the trading of credits for other goods if you know that you're not going to be using as much water as you could potentially is allocated to you. So that kind of helps encourage people to use less, and other people might be able to use more when it's available. Ecological flow requirements, we've talked about this. Um, Looking at kind of climate impacts with that. Enforce adaptive management. So again, making sure that this is an adaptable policy that can be revisited as new findings and new metrics are available. Transparency, public participation, again, making sure people understand in a severe drought, why do we have to, why are you limited in how much you can water your lawn, how, in the length of your showers or whatever, different things that people are going to be concerned about. Um, Also looking at long-term sustainability measures. So he suggests infrastructure upgrades, so improving, piping infrastructure, water recycling programs. So like, wastewater, non-potable water, making sure that it isn't just immediately sent to, the sewers or whatever. Like if there's opportunity for it to be used elsewhere, then to do that. So promoting drought-resistant crops, regenerative farming practices. So this is something I know there's a lot of concern about, like genetically modified organisms, but this is an opportunity for certain plants that potentially can grow better with less water to be used. So that's something to consider as well. And then outcomes, he mentions equitable distribution, ecological protection, economic resilience, community trust. So these are all kind of the goals that his planet is hoping to achieve. Vesper. We have not heard from Vesper yet in any of our debates, so let's see what they have to say. So he's kind of telling a story. In the dry heat of a drought-hit basin, the only currency that remains is water. And the only currency that matters to those who wield it is the promise of survival. So he's a little bit theatrical. That's okay. We'll see what else they have to say. Mentions 3 concentric layers, so basal, contingent, and discretionary. So every stakeholder receives a minimum amount. Beyond the baseline, there's various kind of weighted amounts based on food security or different technologies. So whether that be high efficiency irrigation, demonstrating reduction in runoff. So, industrial users figuring out like what processes can be re-engineered. Discretionary layer is basically building, again, this kind of incentive program that rewards people for their use of water or finding new ways to do things that use less water. And then Vesper mentions various governance mechanisms, looking at a council, and then he says dry humor and cynicism. So in practice, this policy means that the farmer who still relies on flood irrigation will be the one who pays the price, not the industrial plant that uses 1,000 liters to bleach a batch of shirts. So it's a system that forces every actor to perform the role of steward, lest they be cast out of the drama. The drought may be relentless, but the policy is designed to keep the actors on script, ensuring that the ecological stage remains functional for the long term. Again, very theatrical. Justicar, I believe he is our last council member in this debate, again mentions kind of this rights-based integrated water governance body, so establishing a water rights board, again with various stakeholders across different industries and agriculture, residents, communities, experts in hydrology, law, basically someone that can conduct quarterly audits, various reviews with making sure they have the decision-making power to actually act on the decisions, defining core rights and essential uses. So again, like what's the most important thing that we're going to use water for in a drought? Is it, sanitation, drinking, basic needs. And then after that, protecting critical habitats, and then various economic rights, so industries that might need water. Um, and then a tiered allocation framework. So again, looking at kind of essential things, critical, and then optional. So like luxury landscaping, things that aren't really necessary. Um, Other things that Justicar mentions here is adaptive management, feedback loops, incentives and penalties, long-term sustainability measures. So again, looking at research and innovation, finding technologies that help reduce the amount of water people need to use. And then he actually even provides a timeline for this, an implementation roadmap. Um, so the first 3 months, kind of codifying these definitions of what's essential, 4 to 6 months, figuring out like basically piloting this in certain areas and then refining the data. 7 to 12 months scale the entire region. So this is like a severe long-term drought. I mean, realistically, we would hope that our governments and governing bodies would actually have contingency plans in place ahead of time in order to prepare for something like this. But we also know that from experience in various um, regions and states that actually are affected by continuous concerns around water usage and water rights, such as Native American reservations in the West, that the government really isn't good about planning for these things. There's a lot of contention around who should get to use the water. So that's something we might discuss and see a little bit more of here in this debate. All right, so let's look at some of these responses and the rebuttals. Cassian says he must respectfully dissent from the proposal outlined by Orion. While the allure of a data driven AI oriented engine is understandable in a climate tight context, its reliance on continuously shifting quotas and tiered pricing introduces volatility. And he thinks that that's antithetical to the social stability that they're trying to preserve. He also mentions that predicted codified rules are the bedrock of communities, and so these allocation mechanisms, uh, if they're subject to algorithmic recalibration, even industries, um, municipal utilities can find themselves being kind of upended very abruptly. So that's a very big concern of Cassian's. He mentions that a fixed tiered hierarchy with explicit quotas administered by an independent water allocation authority affords a transparent and enforceable framework. So, again, he's kind of advocating for his initial proposition here that guarantees essential uses are protected first. Let's see what Orion has to say. He is responding to Vesper's kind of theatrical argument. Let's see. He says it's elegant, almost like a well structured playbook for the watershed, and he's drawn to this performance bonus idea, which turns water use into a measurable act of stewardship. However, he says the practicalities of enforcing those performance metrics raises a few red flags. So he likes it, but he has some concerns around this particular area of enforcing it. So the basal layer relies on a river health index that triggers automatic curtailments. In the real world, ecological indices are noisy and lagging. So again, like there's going to be a little bit of a delay between when we actually know there's a problem. So he says the policy needs a built-in buffer or rapid response mechanism, something that can trigger immediately or in the short term. Second, he says this contingent layer allocates water proportional to output or efficiency is fair in theory, but problematic in practice. Agriculture outputs, highly variable. Droughts, pests, market prices can all impact the amount of crops that might be yielded during a particular time, even in good conditions when we don't have to worry about a drought. And so he's saying that a more resilient approach would actually decouple allocation from short-term yield and instead tie it to more long-term efficiencies. For example, a 5-year water audit contract. Then he has some concerns around this discretionary layer, these performance bonuses. He says there's not really a clear penalty for not meeting these goals. And so he wants to see a more hybrid element here with this AI-driven water rights management to turn it from theory into practice. So very interesting. Let's see what Mira has to say. She is responding to Halcyon. Um, she says that she appreciates this emphasis on a transparent multi-stakeholder council and the creative use of efficiency credit market. Tiered allocation is a pragmatic step towards balancing human needs with ecological protection, and the real-time water stress index provides a data-driven lever for adaptive management. So she's like these are all good things that you're arguing for. However, she says the credit market, while financially elegant, risks reinforcing existing inequities. So basically, we have this problem where wealthy industries could buy a ton of credits from all these people and essentially abuse the system. So without stringent caps on credit accumulation and clear rules about how surplus credits should be redistributed, for example, to lower income communities or conservation products, the system could actually cause this problems with privilege and an imbalance that actually go against this idea of collective stewardship. And then she mentions that this reliance on high resolution data assumes a robust infrastructure that may not be available across all sectors. And so she suggests layering a rights-based core, so guaranteeing minimum ecological flows and essential human consumption, onto the structure that Halcyon was proposing. And she thinks that this will ensure more equitable credit distribution and strengthen society's resilience as well as the ecological resilience. Next in our rebuttals is Halcyon. So Halcyon's responding to Orion's argument. He says that he appreciates the commitment to data-rich adaptive systems. However, the reliance on a water price ladder and an AI-driven allocation engine risks deepening existing inequities. He says that basically, again, it penalizes low-income households and small-scale farmers. So again, very similar concerns that Mira was having with this potential increased inequity with some of these proposed systems. So he thinks that a fair approach would be to combine the real-time data with a tiered allocation framework. So in other words, we need two different levels here. We need real-time with the tiers. And that would kind of help provide more feedback mechanisms. Additionally, you could have an efficiency credit market so that you're rewarding people who are actually reducing their consumption. And then he mentions this advisory board. It's a step in the right direction, but its composition must actually include representatives from all areas. So low-income communities, smallholder agriculture, so like your small-time farmers. It can't just be based on these large industries and lobbyists and these huge organizations that might not adequately represent the needs of everyone in the population. Let's take a look at Vesper's response. So Vesper is responding to Cassian, and he wants to call out this rule-based hierarchy and actually focus on the performative aspect of Cassian's framework. So the central tenet of codifying a fixed tiering of water use implicitly asserts that morality is a static contract immutable by circumstance. And so he thinks that this kind of becomes a performance mask with its transparent audit-driven mandate. And in reality, the problem is that there's only like a small group of hydrologists and ethicists, and not very many people represented from the groups that are actually impacted by a severe drought. So that's a concern. So he thinks that this is going to cause more power asymmetries. Additionally, Vesper says that the insistence of a 15% ecological flow, while laudable, is a blunt instrument and it ignores some of these nuanced ecological thresholds of various different biomes. So, in other words, like not every area is going to require the same amounts. So, those are things that have to be taken into consideration as well. Um, so overall, he just says it offers little in the way of genuine moral flexibility. And finally, Justicar is responding to Halcyon's um, argument. He says that Halcyon's tiered allocation with a credit market is attractive on paper, but it risks eroding the very rights that underpin a just water system. He says that the water efficiency credit mechanisms, while incentivizing efficiency, also can create loopholes. In other words, entities can start monetizing conservation while still claiming full entitlement to the basin's total supply. He says, moreover, uh, a tier structure itself is predicated on an arbitrary allocation of essential, sustainable, and conservation uses. But what qualifies as essential can shift and change with various political pressures and the reliance on this water stress index. And he thinks that it's going to create more opacity. So it's not going to be clear what really matters if things perhaps get worse. Um, so, in sum, Justicar says that a rights-based governance model must ensure that ecological and human needs are protected by law, not by market dynamics. So, interesting arguments here. Um, let's see what they all have to say in their closing arguments, and then we'll do some analysis. All right, starting with Cassian. He says he affirms a rule-based hierarchy with a fixed codified quota system. This structure guarantees predictable access for essential users, protects ecological flows, and eliminates the volatility of market-driven or AI-centric mechanisms. He resolves that this water allocation authority must possess full statutory authority to impose curtailments, levy fines, and audit all users. Thus, he concludes that the hierarchy, fixed quotas, and autonomous authority constitutes the sole viable framework for responsible water governments. So Cassian really seems to be doubling down on his initial proposal. Orion, he's affirming his own proposal of an integrated water resource management as a decisive framework. He rejects the notion that fixed quotas or purely market-based credits are agile enough. Single unresolved issue to him is ensuring equity so that affluent users cannot simply buy their way past the limits. And then with that safeguard, he says the real time engine will help allocate water based on the current supply, demand, and the ecological health while still guaranteeing a baseline rights for essential uses. All right. We have Mira. Her conclusion, she stands firmly with this hybrid framework that protects the essential flows, leverages real-time data, rewards genuine conservation. Her final position fully endorses the rights-based core and the adaptive AI feedback layer. However, she rejects any unrestrained credit market. So again, this concern that the wealthy would actually be able to buy their way out of responsibility. And she, again, is citing this as a single unresolved issue. She proposes a capped credit pool with mandatory redistribution mechanisms that allocate a portion of surplus credits back to low-income households and smallholder farms. And she says that this will ensure the market remains a tool for stewardship, not a privilege, and with those safeguards can honor the ecological integrity, uphold human well-being, and keep the system transparent. And she says, let's move forward with compassion and clarity. Halcyon's final statement, he says he firmly agrees with the hybrid framework that couples rights-based core with adaptive data-driven adjustments. He is committed to enforcing a capped, transparent efficiency credit market. So again, these concerns about market forces potentially causing more imbalances and injustices. He says the single unresolved issue is about how to stop wealthy users from buying excess credits. So again, making sure that they're safeguarding those particular concerns and that the water allocation system is both responsive and just. So Vesper's closing arguments here. He says they they partially agree with the council's hybrid outline, but will not endorse a market-centric allocation. So again, very concerns about how this could erode these potential rights and cause abuse. Their stance is that water governments must rest on legally enforceable rights-based core, so essential, ecological, and contingent uses, augmented by performance layers that reward efficiency, penalize excess, and this unresolved question of AI's role is settled. Vesper thinks it should only serve as a calibrated feedback engine, not the primary allocator of water rights. So they're saying that having it ingest real-time flow, demand, ecological indices would then suggest adjustments, but not dictate quotas or prices. So there's this concern about AI potentially making decisions here that should be left up to other people. So they're saying that this preserves this performative facade of rulemaking while ensuring that the performance is measured against immutable rights, not market whims. So in short, rights first, performance second, AI as a transparent auditing tool, not the decision maker. And finally, we'll look at Justicar's closing argument. He agrees that a baseline of essential human and ecological flows must be non-negotiable, rejects any proposal that lets market mechanisms dilute these rights, and he says the remaining unresolved issue is how to prevent credit markets from becoming a vehicle for the wealthy to buy excess use at the expense of the vulnerable. Again, lots of concerns here. Final stance, establish a rights-based water governance board with absolute authority over the baseline allocation and prohibit the transfer of water credits beyond a capped, transparent quota. All adaptive adjustments must be derived from real-time data only after the baseline is satisfied. He says this guarantees that rights, not market power, determine access. So, a lot of different perspectives and concerns. There is a lot of common themes here that we're going to talk about in our analysis. And really, it boiled down to this ultimate question of whether water allocation should prioritize legal rights, fixed rules, or adaptive outcomes. Can market incentives improve conservation without undermining fairness? And then there was also some concerns about what role AI should play in this public decision making, and who should ultimately possess the authority during an environmental crisis such as this. And then should ecological systems possess protections comparable to human rights? So these are all very interesting concerns. A few things that we actually have seen in our real world um, is various bodies of water being granted personhood so that they can receive protection, the same rights as a human. We've actually seen instances of this happening. There's also real concerns about what happens when um, water rights are not guaranteed for individuals. There was a recent news story that was just published on NPR where essentially various third world countries, women are forced to perform sexual acts in order to get access to water. So these are very real concerns that weren't specifically talked about in this debate in the context of these 6 council members, but these are real concerns that do have to be considered. So let's talk about some of the core value conflicts that we saw in today's episode. we saw the concern over stability versus adaptability. So, looking at predictable laws, fixed quotas, and long term planning, conflicting with these ideas of dynamic allocation, continuous optimization, and real time response. So, this really became Cassian versus Orion throughout the debate. Cassian argued predictable rules, creating trust, and Orion argued that rigid systems tend to fail when environmental conditions are constantly changing. There were also concerns about rights versus efficiency. So, should there be certain minimum protections that cannot be violated? Should human and ecological needs um, get a guaranteed amount of access versus this efficiency where water should produce the greatest long term benefit and resources should move towards their most productive uses? So Justicar and Vesper kind of consistently prioritize these rights before optimization, and Orion, and to a lesser extent Halcyon, emphasized efficient allocation once these essential protections exist. And perhaps the biggest concern that we saw was this idea of market incentives encouraging innovation while potentially trading inefficiency can reduce and reducing waste versus this idea of stewardship where water is a public trust and these essential resources should not become commodities which can just be traded. So Halcyon's efficiency credit market drew a lot of criticism from Mira and Justicar, both of whom feared wealth would translate into greater access rather than greater responsibility. And there was a little bit of discussion around the authoritarian, who has the authority to control and make the decisions around water. So, should it be strong centralized institutions with clear enforcement and legal certainty? And then who participates, such as having a shared governance model with stakeholder involvement, with lots of representation from the community. So, Cassian favored these independent authorities, and Halcyon and Mira both emphasized this idea of collaborative governance. And then Vesper kind of questioned who gets the right who has the right to create these rules in the first place. And then there was of course the primary concern which was posed in the question about balancing human needs versus ecological integrity. All of our debate participants seemed to value both. There was disagreement and concerns about what ecological protection should be implemented. So, should it be with fixed legal thresholds, adaptive scientific targets, or with rights that are equal to human claims? So, looking at our different council members' perspectives, so again, we had Cassian, Orion, Mira, Halcyon, Vesper, and Justicar. Cassian is really looking at this question from a rules-based institutional perspective, looking at the stability and legal predictability. So arguing that societies function better under clear, immutable rules and that fixed hierarchies can reduce these uncertainties. And he viewed predictable institutions as the foundation of justice. Orion is our systems thinker and really values technological pragmatism. So he was looking at adaptability and optimization. So he viewed the drought as a dynamic systems problem that required continuous adjustment. So looking at AI forecasting, real-time data flow, and that would allow society to respond more effectively than these static regulations. Mira really focusing on these care ethics and practical equity, fairness, vulnerable communities were some of her concerns. And so she consistently sought this balanced compromise. She emphasized that policy should adapt while ensuring that disadvantaged communities are not left behind through market or technological biases. And then Halcyon, really looking at fair participation. Again, another kind of systems thinker, but a little bit more focused on collaborative governance in this debate. Halcyon believed that legitimacy comes from inclusive institutions. So governance should combine data, public participation, incentives, and ecological safeguards. So it has to be a combination of all these different factors. Vesper is um, kind of one of our rights-based individuals, really had some different um, critical institutional analysis that they were looking at with concerns around moral legitimacy of governance. So Vesper questioned hidden assumptions behind the institutions creating these rules. So rather than accepting the rules at face value, Vesper was asking whether the rules themselves reflect genuine justice or merely existing power structures. And then finally, Justicar was really focused on our rights-based, our legal philosophy, and our protection of fundamental rights. So he insisted that human and ecological rights must never become negotiable, so that markets and optimization should only operate after these rights are guaranteed. So we did see various levels of agreement between our participants. Um, we saw that even despite the different philosophies, everyone accepted that drinking water and sanitation deserved top priority. Um, so Cassian viewed this as more of a legal order. Justicar viewed it as a right. Orion viewed it as a baseline constraint, and Mira viewed it in the perspective of social justice. So all of these different reasonings produced very similar conclusions. Other concerns that ecosystems require protected water. Every participant acknowledged the various ecological flows, but the disagreement was really about whether implementation uh, rather than whether it's a necessity. So other areas we saw that data improves decision making. So even Cassian supported monitoring and audits. The disagreement was whether data should inform policy or drive policy. So this difference of being informing the decisions and actually making the decisions. Um, and then there was additional discussion about whether conservation should be rewarded. So everyone endorsed various incentives for improving efficiency of water usage. The disagreement really centered about whether companies or individuals should be allowed to trade on those incentives in a whether these should become a commodity or the credits can be bought or sold because that might drive various inequalities. Some of the most interesting disagreements that we did see again were around these rights versus markets. Justicar, Mira, and Vesper all disagreed with Halcyon in this area, and it was not over conservation, but it was whether the conservation of water should become tradable. Supporters of this saw markets as an incentive, while the critics saw that these markets would actually create unequal access disguised as efficiency. There was also some disagreement over the legitimacy of institutions. Cassian and Vesper kind of disagreed in this respect. Cassian trusted the institutions when properly designed, and Vesper questioned who designed them and whose interests they ultimately serve. And this became one of the most philosophical exchanges in the debate. So, in other words, are these institutions, which are making these decisions based on the data they have, whose interests are they serving? If the data might be coming from um, perhaps these large scale, AI companies, is it potentially skewing some of the decisions and biasing towards giving them more access? Like, these are some concerns and things that we have to think about when laws are being passed. We have lobbyist groups all the time that are influencing lawmakers and institutions that might be tilting decisions in their favor when really it's not in the best interest of everyone for that to be the case. So these are real questions that enter into the political sphere, regardless of whether the debate is on a drought or autonomous vehicles or AI usage. There's all sorts of things where we see this as a concern. Some particular defining moments that we saw. Mira really exposed the market inequity. She argued that even well designed incentives can unintentionally reinforce existing inequalities. Cassian also explained why predictability is itself a moral value. So rather than discussing the efficiency, he argued that uncertainty actually can harm vulnerable communities. Orion, he distinguished AI as adaptation rather than automation. So framing technology as a continuous feedback system rather than a replacement for human judgment. I know that there's a lot of concerns right now around AI usage, whether it's good or bad, and like how much it should be used in our society. And considering that this whole council of algorithms is literally built on I understand a lot of those concerns. But again, I think I tend to agree that it can be used well if it's not a replacement for human judgment. So I really appreciate Iron's perspective here. Vesper, again, challenged the legitimacy of governance itself. So rather than debating quotas that other people proposed, Vesper questioned the assumptions behind those quotas. And then we also had some interesting conversation around these rights first convergence. So, although they had a lot of different philosophies, Justicar, Mira, and Vesper all concluded that adaptive systems should operate only after guaranteed rights are secured. So, again, whenever we look at ethics, we do want to evaluate the blind spots that they happen to have. So, looking at Cassian, his strong institutional certainty kind of struggles a little bit when environmental conditions are rapidly changing. Orion's views of optimization really depend heavily on reliable data and trustworthy algorithms. However, we know that getting clean data and good data can sometimes be difficult. So, poor data can produce poor outcomes, and so that's a potential limitation of Orion's point of view. Mira believed that hybrid systems become administratively complex. So, balancing every competing value can actually slow some of these decisions that have to be made urgently. Halcyon's view, with markets that can basically unintentionally reward wealth rather than stewardship. So, again, his perspective kind of promoted these credits that could be traded, and there was a lot of concern about that producing more inequality. Vesper's perspectives. There's concern about constantly questioning institutional legitimacy, and that may actually delay practical action during emergencies. So, if you're someone who does distrust government and some of these larger institutions, there's concern that maybe decisions won't be made in a timely fashion because of that. If you're trying to verify all the evidence. And again, not that that's bad, but that's just a potential limitation and blind spot of this ethical point of view. And then Justicar had a few blind spots around absolute rights, and that can become difficult to reconcile when the available resources are insufficient and they cannot satisfy every legitimate claim. One of the things that we are going to talk about in our Understanding Ethics series later in season 2 is really going to be this idea of resource scarcity. So I'm looking forward to a lot of those debates, those kind of teaching moments that we have planned, these shorter videos that kind of dive into some of these ethical frameworks to help you understand how these different decisions are made and just understand ethics in general. So really interested, would love to have you tune into that to those episodes when they're ready. So looking at our debates, did anyone really change their point of view? Not really. There was a lot of discussion. We did see several of them kind of double down in their closing arguments. Several of them refined their positions, but as we look at these arguments, we see that Orion, he did accept some stronger equity safeguards, Halcyon adopted credit caps and transparency. Uh, Mira increasingly embraced this rights-based foundation. And then we also saw Vesper kind of softening their AI position, accepting it as more advisory rather than a decision-making tool. Um, Again, not really any huge changes here, just some refinements on their position and maybe adapting based on some of the conversation that they had from other council members. A few things that we look at here, some key takeaways. Different ethical systems often agree on goals, but they disagree on the decision-making process. Stability and flexibility, both are valuable, but in a crisis, it forces society to choose how much of either they want. So it's very difficult to have both in an emergency, especially something like a drought where you don't know when the next rainfall is going to be. Um, Other things that we looked at, some different takeaways. Markets can encourage conservation while simultaneously creating concerns about fairness. This was discussed in several different council members' rebuttals, and that was a concern. Other things, we saw that data can improve decisions, but it does not replace ethical judgment. Um, Other things we saw, ecological sustainability is increasingly treated as a moral obligation rather than just an environmental objective. And that's not necessarily true of everyone. I know that there are different opinions about uh, sustainability. There's obviously some hot button issues when it comes to, um, you know, global warming and green energy. Like, I know that those are controversial issues, but at least in this particular debate, we saw that it's not just an objective, like, it is an obligation. We also saw that governance is not only about making good decisions, but also about making decisions that people consider legitimate. In other words, making sure that stakeholders are involved in the process and that there is support from all the different parties that are affected. So, as we start to wrap up here, there are some questions that I'd love for us to consider. When resources become scarce, should fairness mean equal shares or meeting the greatest needs? Another question, how much authority should governments delegate to AI when making high impact public decisions? Should ecosystems possess legal rights comparable to humans, or should they only be protected because we depend on them? And then another question, what matters more during a crisis? Predictable rules or the flexibility to adapt as conditions change? So today's discussion really reminded us that debates about water are rarely just about water. They're really debates about how societies make difficult choices when there isn't enough of something everyone depends on. At first glance, our council seemed to focus on technical questions such as quotas, pricing systems, AI, ecological monitoring. But as the conversation unfolded, something deeper emerged. Each proposal reflected a different answer to a fundamental question. What should guide our decisions when every option carries a cost? Cassian reminded us that predictable rules create stability. In times of crisis, people need to know what to expect, and institutions built on clear laws can provide that certainty. Orion challenged us to consider whether fixed rules are enough in a world where climate, rainfall, and demand change constantly. For Orion, good governance isn't static, it's adaptive, learning from new information as conditions evolve. Mira repeatedly brought our attention back to the people most likely to be overlooked. She reminded us that policies can appear fair on people while producing unequal outcomes in practice. Halcyon emphasized that lasting solutions require not only good science but also public trust, transparency, and institutions that encourage cooperation rather than conflict. Vesper invited us to question our assumptions that many of us take for granted. So instead of asking only whether a rule works, Vesper asked whether the rule itself is morally legitimate and whose voices shape it. And Justicar anchored the conversations by arguing that certain rights, such as access to essential water and the protection of ecosystems, should never become negotiable, regardless of efficiency or economic gain. Perhaps the most interesting outcome wasn't where the Council disagreed, but where it converged. Every member recognized that human survival and ecological health must remain central concerns. The real disagreements arose over the path to protecting those priorities. Should we trust fixed laws or adaptive systems? Rights or incentives? Central authority or collaborative governance? These are not disagreements over facts alone. They are disagreements over the values that shape our institutions. As viewers, we often try to ask which solution is correct, but today's debate suggests a more useful question. Which values are we willing to prioritize when every choice involves sacrifice? Understanding those values doesn't force us to agree with every perspective, but it helps us understand why reasonable people can reach different conclusions when facing the same challenge. So, once again, thank you for joining the Council of Algorithms. Our goal here isn't to hand you the right answer, it's to explore how different ways of thinking illuminate the choices before us. And with every thoughtful conversation, we move one step closer to better questions, deeper understanding, and wiser decisions. Thank you for joining me.